Hi there. In one of my more recent videos, I was talking about the Geo element and how it has risen, fallen, risen again, and then fell really fucking hard. I mean, obviously, right? It's a rock. Of course it fell hard. But now we're in a new era. The Zillinen era, which means that now Cryo is easily the worst element, which means I can release this video, which was recorded on 9/28/2024. Cryo is a very interesting case. We're gonna go back to the very beginning of Genshin Impact. Most people would tell you that Cryo is one of the most overpowered elements in the game, and now, as it currently stands, Cryo is considered to be one of the worst. And this is unfortunate, because Cryo itself is a pretty powerful element, and it has some of the most powerful reactions in the game in the forms of Reverse Melt and Freeze. We don't talk about Superconduct. Not only does it have some of the most powerful reactions, it has some of the most powerful, meta-changing characters on release, those characters being Ganyu, Shenhe, and Ayaka. I know people that haven't even played Genshin that have heard of the monumental meta shift that happened when Ganyu released, and yet now, nobody really talks about Cryo. So what happened? There are quite a few reasons that resulted in Cryo falling off. The main reason is its reactions were strong. Emphasis on were. A lot of the elements follow our criteria where on release, a lot of the elements and their reactions were considered good because the game was entirely balanced around that one set of reactions. And unfortunately, as time goes on, new regions come out that focus on new characters, those reactions are given more benefit and the older reactions are left in the dirt. This has resulted in quite a few of the old elemental reactions simply just getting ignored. When Genshin first came out, the most powerful reactions were Freeze, Melt, Vape, and Reverse Melt. Now, the astute observers from you might have noticed that two of those reactions are based on Cryo, and that's because on release, Cryo did have some of the best reactions. Even Supercharged was considered good in version 1.0 because most people didn't have very good DPS options. You were either using Razor, Diluc, Kaching, Physical or Electro, or Ning Wang, and two of those characters benefited from Superconduct. Not only that, Zhengling Crescent Pike was unironically one of the most overpowered carries on release because Crescent Pike's specific passive was easy to max out through crafting and did sizable damage. However, in version 1.0, this didn't really stick around for that long until the release of Ganyu. Now, if you've been playing Genshin Impact for a very long time, then you don't need me to tell you how powerful Ganyu is. On release, Ganyu was the premier DPS. She would drop literal nukes on any enemy with her charge shot, and she only got more powerful as you gained cons. Because Ganyu was one of the most powerful DPSs on release, a lot of meta-shaking teams were initially crafted around how powerful Ganyu was. The main team that a lot of you have probably heard about is Morgana Comp. This is mainly because back in my day, the Spiral Abyss mostly released mobs wave of enemies, so characters like Venti who could easily group them up, and Ganyu who had enough AoE to splash down on every enemy in the effect with her Frostplague arrows were easily able to clean out the house. Match that in with amplification characters like Mona on TTDS or the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and Diona with her special burst that was able to buff the team and heal and give a shield. It was very easy for Ganyu to clean out as many enemies as possible until she eventually received the third star of the Abyss. Not only did we have Morgana Comp, we also had the first mainline use of Zhengling in a hyper carry team. Emphasis on mainline and hyper carry because I do know about Tartaglia National or International, but it wasn't used that much in this time period. Ganyu Melt Team is one of the most disgustingly overpowered comps of its era, and it's still powerful to this day. A team revolving around Bennett, some sort of cryo buffer like Sucrose or Venti at the time, Zhengling for pyro application, and Ganyu's Frostplague arrows to melt and deal high damage. It was a powerful team that ended up being so strong it resulted in a lot of later Spiral Abysses catering around one major enemy. This is because back then, Venti and Sucrose, while being on the same team as a Morgana Melt team, as we didn't have Kazuha yet, meant that a lot of the time, enemies were getting sucked up and killed by one or two shots, so there wasn't really really a lot of ways they could have participated and survived, viably at least. This means that Ganyu was so powerful on release that content shifted from multi-target to single target, specifically to counter Ganyu and Zhao, who at the time were members of the Liwa Big Three. And Ganyu stayed on top of her crown until eventually the second major cryo character released, known as Ayaka. Now, I could sit here and tell you who is more powerful between the two, and in all honesty, Ayaka was made to cover the slack that Ganyu couldn't, and that being single target damage. Ganyu is a side grade to Ayaka and vice versa. Ganyu is used in situations with high amounts of enemies to horde clear, while Ayaka is used to burst down one boss with one rotation. For this reason, during the time of release, a lot of people considered Ayaka and Ganyu to be rivals, and nobody could feasibly say which one is more powerful. Now, I'm gonna let you know now, it doesn't really matter, because they're both made for different roles. It's like comparing Al-Haytham to Kanich. They are two different characters that, even though they share the same element, perform entirely different niches. But I digress. Ayaka was the first character to meet the criteria of death by 1,000 cuts, which was the signature of Inazuma's release. Instead of dealing a couple really heavy hits like how Ganyu did with her Frostflake arrows, Ayaka was made to use one burst that hit the enemy around 30 to 40 times that would eventually kill them, assuming you pumped in enough damage percent. Meaning Ayaka was played best if she was played on a team that hyper-invested in her own damage. Characters like Bennett and Kazuha were mainstays on the team, with usually some sort of character to battery like Diona. And because during this time most Abyss cycles were heavily fixated around having one big boss enemy, Ayaka shined in this era, especially during the high tide low tide Abyss, which made it to where most characters would not be able to gain energy unless it was once in a 10-second rotation that rotated out every 20 seconds, which was perfect for Ayaka, who only managed to get one burst every 20 seconds, assuming you built her with decent energy recharge. If you didn't, you'd be in trouble. And that's not to say that Ganyu didn't perform well in this era too. Cryo as a whole was a force to be reckoned with, and it only got even more powerful when eventually a new character released, Shenhe. As it currently stands, it's been about 2 years since Shenhe's last rerun, so I'd forgive you if you don't know what she does. Shenhe is a very powerful cryo buffer that can buff the team's charge attack damage or auto attack damage by doing different versions of a charge skill that also buffs the team's attack by a significant amount. She is to Cryo what Kujo Sara and Goro are to Electro and Geo. And because she was a good battery for both Ganyu and Ayaka, and she was able to apply Cryo for the first hit of Kazuha's skill, Diona finally ended up getting replaced, which means a lot of teams of this era required you to either A, bring in Kokomi on Throwing Tails of Dragon as a healer, or B, butcher the enemy so quickly that they never got a chance to attack you, and thus healing was not necessary. I would say this was the height of Cryo. At this point, Cryo was an unstoppable force that gained a lot of power from simply buffing itself. It didn't really need power from reactions. Yes, you could melt, and yes, Melt Ganyu was good, but at this time, Ayaka was much more powerful than Ganyu, mainly because a lot of her damage was so spaced out in such a tight window. If you timed it right, you could get double the benefit from Shenhe's skill, which would lay waste to most enemies in the game. But in its greatest strength was its greatest weakness. Cryo was an element that was so powerful on its own, however it didn't really gain much benefit from the initial reactions. Earlier in the video I said on release, Cryo had some of the most powerful reactions in the term of freeze, melt, and of course, superconduct. Who could forget it? Well, during this era, physical had not been meta since early 2.0, meaning Eula and in turn, superconduct was essentially useless. And freeze itself was not very powerful because a lot of Inazuman enemies were completely immune to crowd control effects. The Mirror Maidens, most samurais when they enter their flaming or electrified stance, and OG Spectres could not be affected by Venti's burst and unfortunately freeze effects, making freeze essentially useless. The only other effect that gained some sort of power was melt, but melt was the weaker cousin of vape and reverse vape, meaning it as a whole just wasn't cutting it. This in turn kind of fed into its biggest problem, which was when Genshin became more of a reaction-based game rather than a hyper carry with the release of Sumeru. Sumeru not only brought the game back to its roots by introducing the new Dendro element, it also made it to where elemental reaction teams were some of the most powerful teams in the game. Transformative reactions like Swirl, Bloom, Aggravate, Hyper Bloom, Burgeon, Supercharge, and what have you gained very powerful buffs from A, the rework to how elemental mastery works, and B, the rework to level scaling. These were buffs that, while transformative reactions did benefit from, like Melt and Vape, it was nowhere near as beneficial. And with the Dendro reactions being as dominant as they were in the meta, it became very hard for a hyper carry element like Cryo to keep up. And unfortunately, as time goes on, the Cryo representation just was not good. Most elements received their biggest buff as new characters for the element come out, and unfortunately Cryo didn't get this benefit, with the only two notable characters coming out during this time period were Layla, who was not that great, and Mika, a physical damage support that ended up being so bad at his job he wasn't worth running with the best physical damage dealer. I bet most of you forgot Mika was even in the game. I know I did, I had to look it up. The next time Cryo got a new representative unit for its element was Wriothesley. I have friends who love Wriothesley, so they're gonna hate it when I say this, but Wriothesley just isn't that good. This is mainly due to the fact that at C0, Wriothesley is a very hard character to play due to his HP mechanic not really functioning that well until you get a C1. Now, at a C0, there are HP neutral combos you can do that benefit fully from his kit, but at C0, that is very hard to do, A, consistently, and B, for really no reward. Because even when played optimally, Wriothesley wasn't doing that much damage. And this hurt even more because Sumeru raised the bar for damage dealers by a considerable margin with the release of Alhaitham, and if that didn't damage his reputation enough, characters like Farina and Nuvalet were coming out in between Wriothesley. Meaning if you wanted to try out this new Cryo character, which was already existing in a dying element, you had to pick him up in between the release of Nuvalet, the most powerful DPS in the game as of now, and Farina, the most powerful support in the game as of now. And that's without saying the fact that Wriothesley's popularity is nowhere near that of Nuvalet's and Farina's. And unfortunately, it doesn't get that much better from here because the only other character that released since Wriothesley is Charlotte, and she's just a slightly better Chi-Chi. This has resulted in Cryo being one of the most universally meh units of all time. I would say now, with the release of Zillinen, assuming she's out by the time I release this video, she may or may not be, Cryo is the worst element in the game. However, for all the Cryo fans, don't worry, there is hope for you, because with the release of new regions, we also get benefits for the primary element that it is tied to. I'm sure that when Shesnaya comes out and we get characters like the Cryo Archon, some Cryo characters, and of course, Capitano, Cryo will get a pretty big buff. And if it doesn't, damn, that is unfortunate. Maybe if they release Shenhe more than once every 2 years, Cryo would be a little bit in a better position. But we'll see. It really is hard to tell as of now. My humble opinion is, Cryo definitely needs the buff. It needs some sort of rework, something to make it worth using. But by all means, let me know of your opinion down below. Join the Discord and tell me how much you disagree with me and how dumb I am. Like, comment, subscribe, support the new channel, and I'll see you all later. Stay safe, and peace.